I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. The weather was perfect, clear skies, a slight breeze, and the golden sun beaming down on my backyard. It was the ideal day for a barbecue, and I wasn't about to let it go to waste. I had invited some of my closest friends, a few neighbors I actually liked, and of course, my family. We had everything ready. The grill was fired up, the cooler was packed with ice-cold drinks, and the speakers played soft background music. The smell of sizzling burgers and perfectly marinated ribs filled the air, mixing with the scent of fresh-cut grass. As people arrived, laughter and conversation started flowing naturally. We weren't being obnoxious, just enjoying ourselves like normal people do. My best friend, Jake, cracked one of his legendary dad jokes, so terrible it was hilarious, and the whole group burst into laughter. My cousin nearly choked on his soda from laughing too hard. This was exactly the kind of day I had envisioned: good food, great company, and plenty of fun. What I didn't know was that my perfect barbecue was about to be ruined. About an hour into the party, I noticed a curtain shifting in the window of the house next door. It was subtle, but I knew exactly who it was: Mrs. Carmichael. My neighbor, and the self-appointed queen of misery. She had lived next door for years, and in all that time, I had never seen her smile. She wasn't just the kind of person who disliked fun, she was outright offended by it. If she heard kids laughing, she'd call their parents to complain. If someone played music, she'd call the HOA. If you so much as sneezed too loudly, she'd probably write a formal complaint about it. I tried to ignore her, but out of the corner of my eye, I could see her watching us. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, her arms crossed so tightly that I thought she might snap in half. I knew what was coming before it even happened. The next morning, I woke up, still feeling great from the previous day's barbecue. That feeling lasted exactly 5 minutes, until I checked my email. Subject: noise complaint, excessive laughter. I had to read it twice just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. The email, sent by the HOA, explained that a concerned neighbor had filed an official complaint against me for excessive laughter at my gathering. It stated that I had created a disruptive atmosphere in the neighborhood and that my actions were in violation of the community's noise policies. I sat there in disbelief, rereading the words as if they would magically change into something that made sense. Excessive laughter? Was that even a real thing? The email continued, stating that if the behavior continued, I could face a fine or even a temporary ban on hosting events at my own home. I felt my blood pressure rising. This had to be a joke. I knew exactly who had filed the complaint. There was only one person miserable enough to do it. Still dressed in my pajama pants and a t-shirt, I marched next door and rang Mrs. Carmichael's doorbell. She opened the door just a crack, just enough to look at me but not enough to invite a conversation. "Good morning," she said flatly, her voice devoid of any warmth. "Morning," I replied, forcing myself to be polite. "I just got an email from the HOA. Apparently someone reported me for excessive laughter?" Her lips twitched, but she didn't look surprised. "Oh. Yes, that was me." I blinked. "You actually complained to the HOA because people were laughing at my barbecue?" She sniffed, tilting her nose up slightly. "It was disruptive." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "It was a Saturday afternoon. It doesn't matter. It was too loud," she said, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I couldn't even enjoy my book." I stared at her. She had officially lost it. "Mrs. Carmichael," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "are you telling me that my friends and I were laughing so loudly that it ruined your day?" She didn't even hesitate. "Yes." I could feel my jaw clench. This was beyond ridiculous. "So what, I'm just supposed to sit in my backyard in complete silence? Am I allowed to breathe, or is that too disruptive as well?" She pursed her lips. "There's no need to be dramatic. Just be quieter next time." Next time? There wasn't going to be a next time, not without a fight. I turned on my heel and walked away before I said something I'd regret. The moment I got back inside, I grabbed my phone and started typing up a response to the HOA. I wasn't about to let this slide. This was my house, my backyard, and my gathering. I had followed all the HOA rules. I wasn't blasting music at night. I wasn't causing property damage, and I sure as hell wasn't throwing wild parties. If my only crime was enjoying my life, then this was going to be a battle I was ready to fight. I crafted my email carefully, pointing out that there were no specific HOA rules regarding laughter, that my barbecue took place during reasonable hours, and that no other neighbors had complained. I also added that if the HOA truly believed excessive laughter was a problem, I would be happy to take it to the board and let them publicly decide whether joy was a punishable offense. I hit send and leaned back in my chair, exhaling sharply. If Mrs. Carmichael thought she could silence me, she was in for a rude awakening. This was just the beginning. The email from the HOA still sat open on my screen, mocking me with its absurdity. Excessive laughter. I had read it at least 5 times, hoping that my brain had just misunderstood, that maybe there was some logical explanation. But no, it was exactly as ridiculous as it seemed. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples. My patience had already been tested by Mrs. Carmichael's sour attitude, but this was beyond petty. I wasn't going to let this slide. I grabbed my phone and called the HOA office. After a few rings, a cheerful yet painfully robotic voice answered. "Thank you for calling the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. This is Diane speaking. How can I assist you today?" I took a deep breath, doing my best to sound calm. "Hi, Diane. My name is your name, and I just received an email about a noise complaint." "Certainly. Can I have your address, please?" I gave her the information, tapping my fingers impatiently against the desk as she pulled up my file. "Ah, yes. I see here that a complaint was filed regarding excessive noise on Saturday." I let out a short laugh. "Yeah, excessive laughter." There was a pause on the other end. I could almost hear her trying to keep a straight face. "Yes, that is what the report says. So, I just want to clarify something," I said, leaning forward. "Is laughing in my own backyard against HOA rules?" Another pause. "Not specifically, but all homeowners are expected to maintain a peaceful environment for their neighbors." I raised an eyebrow. "Diane, do you personally believe laughter is a violation of a peaceful environment?" She cleared her throat. "I can't comment on that, sir. I can only relay what's in the complaint." I sighed. "All right, so what happens now? Am I expected to apologize for having fun?" "Well, the first step is a written warning, which has already been sent." "And if I continue laughing?" I asked dryly. "If further complaints are filed, the board may issue a fine or impose restrictions on future gatherings." I almost dropped my phone. "You're kidding." "I assure you, sir, the HOA takes all complaints seriously." I pinched the bridge of my nose. "And if I want to dispute this nonsense?" "You can request a hearing with the HOA board." That was all I needed to hear. "All right, Diane. Sign me up. I'd love to hear the board explain how laughing is a crime." If I was going to fight this, I needed proof that this complaint was beyond ridiculous. The first thing I did was talk to my other neighbors. I went door to door, asking if anyone had been disturbed by my barbecue. Every single one of them had the same reaction: confusion, followed by laughter when I told them what Mrs. Carmichael had done. Mr. Peterson, the elderly man 2 houses down, chuckled and clapped me on the shoulder. "Son, I've lived here for 30 years, and I've never heard of someone being reported for laughing. That lady's lost her mind." The Johnsons, who lived directly across from me, shook their heads. "We were home the whole time. Your barbecue wasn't loud at all. If anything, it was nice to hear people enjoying themselves." Even my next-door neighbor on the other side, who I barely knew, said he hadn't heard anything disruptive. I asked each of them if they'd be willing to sign a statement saying they hadn't been disturbed, and to my relief, everyone agreed. I also decided to check my security cameras. I had one set up on my back patio, and while it didn't pick up audio, it showed the entire barbecue. The footage proved that we weren't throwing some out-of-control party, just a normal gathering with food and conversation. Just as I thought I had all the proof I needed, I received a text message from an unknown number. Unknown: "Hey, I heard about your HOA complaint. I might have something that can help." I frowned, typing back. "Me, who is this?" Unknown: "A neighbor. Can we meet?" That was cryptic, but I was too curious to ignore it. I agreed to meet them at the community park. When I arrived, I was surprised to see Jessica, a woman who lived a few houses down. I didn't know her well, but I had seen her at HOA meetings before. "Hey," she said, glancing around as if checking for spies. "I heard about your situation, and I wanted to tell you something." "All right," I said, crossing my arms. She lowered her voice. "Mrs. Carmichael has been trying to get you in trouble for months." I raised an eyebrow. "What?" "She complains about you at almost every HOA meeting. First, it was your grass being too green, then it was your trash bins being too close to the curb. Now it's this." I scoffed. "Are you serious?" Jessica nodded. "She's been looking for any excuse to make your life miserable." I sighed. This was worse than I thought. "Why does she hate me so much?" Jessica smirked. "Honestly? I think she just hates fun. But I also heard her mention something about how your house attracts too much attention." That was interesting. My house wasn't anything special, but I did have friends and family over more often than some of the other neighbors. Maybe that annoyed her? Jessica handed me a small USB drive. "I recorded the last HOA meeting. You might find it useful." I took it, feeling a surge of gratitude. "Thanks, Jessica. This means a lot." She shrugged. "Anything to stick it to Mrs. Carmichael." Armed with my evidence, I sent an official request for an HOA hearing. If they wanted to play this game, I was going to make sure it blew up in their faces. I had my signed statements. I had security footage. And now, I had proof that Mrs. Carmichael had been plotting against me for months. There was no way I was going down without a fight. I sat back, a smirk forming on my face. If Mrs. Carmichael thought she could silence me, she was about to learn a very loud lesson. I wasn't the type of person to get into unnecessary conflicts, but this was ridiculous. Being fined for laughing? Getting written up for simply enjoying time with friends and family? No way. I wasn't going to let this slide. The HOA had overstepped, and I intended to make them regret it. The HOA hearing was set for Saturday morning in the community center. I had a full week to prepare, and I was going to make sure I had everything I needed to tear their argument apart. First, I organized all my evidence. White heavy check marks signed statements from my neighbors confirming that they hadn't been disturbed by my barbecue. White heavy check mark security footage from my backyard camera, showing a completely normal gathering with no outrageous noise. White heavy check mark the recording from Jessica, proving that Mrs. Carmichael had been targeting me for months. I also reviewed the HOA's bylaws. Nowhere did it state that laughter or general backyard gatherings were prohibited. The noise restrictions only mentioned excessive loud disturbances past 10 p.m., which didn't apply since my barbecue ended well before then. I printed out multiple copies of everything, making sure I had enough for every HOA board member. If they wanted a fight, I was bringing an arsenal. Saturday morning arrived, and I walked into the community center with confidence. The board members sat at a long table in the front, wearing their usual smug expressions. Mrs. Carmichael sat among them, her arms crossed, lips pursed in satisfaction. The room was filled with other homeowners who had their own disputes to settle, but as I took my seat, I could feel eyes on me. It seemed like word had gotten around about my absurd complaint. One of the board members, Mr. Whitman, cleared his throat. "All right, let's begin. We're here today to discuss a noise complaint filed against your name for excessive disturbance during a backyard gathering." I leaned forward. "Just to clarify, we're talking about laughter, right?" A few people in the audience chuckled, but Mrs. Carmichael shot them a glare. Mr. Whitman sighed. "The complaint states that your gathering was disruptive to your neighbor's peace." I smirked. I'd love to know how laughter violates any HOA rule. Mrs. Carmichael spoke up, her voice dripping with fake authority. It's not about the laughing, it's about the excessive noise. I couldn't even hear my own television. I tilted my head. So, because my friends and I had a good time in my own backyard, I should be fined? It's about common courtesy, she snapped. I pulled out my stack of papers and passed copies to the board. These are signed statements from multiple neighbors, all confirming that they were not disturbed by my barbecue. In fact, most of them didn't even hear anything unusual. Mr. Whitman flipped through the pages, looking a little uncomfortable. I continued. I also have security footage of the gathering. No shouting, no music blaring, just normal conversation and yes, laughing. Which, last I checked, isn't illegal. Mrs. Carmichael's face turned red, but I wasn't done yet. And to top it off, I said, pulling out my final weapon, I have this. I held up the USB drive. A recording from a previous HOA meeting, where Mrs. Carmichael openly complains about me, proving that she has been targeting me long before this so-called noise complaint. The room went silent. Even some of the board members shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Carmichael's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Would you care to explain why you've been so determined to punish me? I asked, staring directly at her. She scoffed, folding her arms. You think I'm targeting you? I smirked. That's exactly what you're doing. And I think this entire board knows it now. Mr. Whitman cleared his throat, obviously trying to regain control of the meeting. Well, given the evidence presented, I don't see enough grounds for further action against your name. A few board members nodded. One even muttered, This is ridiculous. Mr. Whitman looked at Mrs. Carmichael. Do you have anything else to add? Her face was bright red, her jaw clenched. She knew she was losing. She huffed. Fine. But he should still be more mindful of his noise levels in the future. I chuckled. Don't worry, I'll try to keep my laughter at an acceptable volume. A few people in the audience laughed. Mrs. Carmichael shot me one last glare before turning away in defeat. Mr. Whitman sighed. All right, with no further reason to proceed, this case is dismissed. I leaned back in my chair, feeling victorious. But just as I thought the ordeal was over, something happened that I did not expect. As the meeting wrapped up, a middle-aged man in a suit approached me. He looked familiar, but I couldn't place him. Hey, he said, extending his hand. I'm Mark, and I live 3 streets over. I just wanted to say, that was hilarious. I shook his hand, raising an eyebrow. Thanks, I guess? He chuckled. Listen, I've had my own issues with the HOA, and I've been trying to rally people to push back against their nonsense. You just did exactly what we need, stood up to them and won. I frowned. What are you saying? He smirked. How would you feel about helping me start a neighborhood-wide effort to keep the HOA in check? I blinked. You mean, like a homeowners resistance group? He nodded. I thought about it for a second, then glanced at Mrs. Carmichael, who was still fuming in her seat. A slow grin spread across my face. I'm in. After winning my case against the HOA, I should have felt relieved. I had exposed Mrs. Carmichael's pettiness, gotten the bogus fine dismissed, and even gained some allies in my neighborhood. But something still didn't sit right with me. If this had just been about noise, she would have let it go after the hearing. Instead, I could feel her seething anger every time I crossed paths with her. That wasn't normal. This wasn't just about my laughter. It was something more personal. And I was going to find out exactly what. Over the next few days, I noticed something odd. Mrs. Carmichael seemed to be watching me. It wasn't obvious at first. A glance from her window. A lingering look when I took out the trash. But the more I paid attention, the more it became clear she was keeping tabs on me. Why? Was she waiting for me to slip up? Looking for something new to report? I needed answers. So, I did what any reasonable person would do. I decided to do a little investigating of my own. I started by talking to my neighbor Jessica, The same one who had tipped me off about Mrs. Carmichael's complaints before. When I knocked on her door, she answered almost immediately, like she had been expecting me. "Let me guess," she said with a smirk. "You're still thinking about the laughter thing?" I nodded. "I don't think she's done with me, Jess. She's been watching my house." Jessica sighed, crossing her arms. "Yeah, I figured. You're not the first person she's harassed, you know." That caught my attention. "What do you mean?" She leaned against the doorframe. "Mrs. Carmichael has a history of messing with people in the neighborhood, especially if she doesn't like them. She's run off a few families before. One guy even sold his house just to get away from her." I frowned. "But why? What's her deal?" Jessica gave me a look. "You really don't know?" I shook my head. She sighed. "It's because of your house." I blinked. "What?" Jessica nodded. "Before you moved in, she was trying to buy your house for her sister. She put in an offer, but the seller went with you instead. She's been bitter about it ever since." My jaw dropped. "You're telling me this entire thing, the complaint, the spying, the fines, is all because she's mad that I bought my house?" Jessica nodded. "Yep. And trust me, she's not going to stop." I exhaled sharply. Unbelievable. I had been dealing with all of this nonsense because of some personal grudge? That was insane. But it also meant that I now had a huge advantage. Now that I knew the truth, I needed proof. Jessica gave me a few leads, other neighbors who had also been harassed by Mrs. Carmichael. Over the next couple of days, I talked to them and collected even more stories. A retired couple who had been fined for having the wrong color mailbox. A single mother who received daily HOA warnings for clutter in her yard, despite having nothing more than a few kids' toys outside. A young couple who had a fence installed only to have Mrs. Carmichael order them to take it down, even though it was HOA approved. It was a pattern. She wasn't just difficult, she was abusing her power. And it was time to put an end to it. Now that I had enough information, I needed to do one last thing: catch her in the act. Since she had been spying on me, I decided to give her something to watch. I set up a fake scenario, an obviously staged barbecue, with just one other friend. No loud music. No excessive laughter. Just two people sitting in the backyard, chatting. I also made sure to have a hidden camera facing the street, capturing anyone who might try to snoop around. Sure enough, it didn't take long. Less than an hour into our gathering, I saw her, Mrs. Carmichael, walking by slowly, pretending to be taking a stroll. But I knew what she was doing. She pulled out her phone, took a few pictures of my yard, then walked off. Gotcha. The next day, I took my evidence straight to the HOA board. This time, I wasn't asking for anything. I was demanding action. I walked into the HOA office, slammed a folder full of complaints onto the table, and looked Mr. Whitman dead in the eyes. "This needs to stop." He raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" I opened the folder. "These are signed statements from multiple homeowners, all detailing how Mrs. Carmichael has abused her position to harass people." He flipped through the pages, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern. I continued. "I also have video evidence of her spying on me, documenting my backyard like some kind of private investigator." I pulled out my phone and played the footage. Mr. Whitman's face hardened. "I'm done putting up with this," I said firmly. "Either the board does something about her, or I start looking into legal action." I could see the wheels turning in his head. Finally, after a long pause, he sighed. "I'll bring this up in our next meeting." I folded my arms. "No, you'll bring it up now." He looked at me for a moment, then nodded. "All right. Let's deal with this." A few days later, the HOA held a special emergency meeting. This time, it wasn't me on the chopping block. It was Mrs. Carmichael. With all the evidence I had gathered, plus testimony from other homeowners, it became clear that she had been weaponizing HOA rules for her own personal vendettas. And the board had no choice but to take action. Mrs. Carmichael was removed from the HOA committee and stripped of any decision-making power. She was furious, but she couldn't do anything about it. As for me? Well, I had won. Not just for myself, but for everyone she had harassed. But I wasn't done yet. Because I still had one last move left to play. Mrs. Carmichael may have lost her position on the HOA board, but that didn't mean she had learned her lesson. If anything, losing her power only made her more bitter. She still shot me dirty looks every time she saw me. She still walked by my house as if she was inspecting something. And she still acted like she owned the entire neighborhood. But the difference now? She had no authority left. And that meant it was the perfect time for me to deliver some sweet, poetic justice. After everything she had put me through, I wanted to do something that would be both satisfying and hilarious. A way to expose her for what she truly was while making sure the entire neighborhood was in on the joke. And I had just the idea. It was time to throw the biggest, loudest, most outrageous barbecue party this neighborhood had ever seen. Now, I knew that throwing a loud party could technically still violate HOA rules, but I had learned the rulebook inside out by now. So, I made sure to follow every single guideline to the letter. Noise levels? Kept within the legal decibel limit. Guest parking? All visitors parked in designated spots. Trash and cleanup? Hired a cleaning service in advance. Start and end time? Followed the HOA's exact event guidelines. I made sure that there was absolutely nothing the HOA could fine me for. But at the same time, I pulled out all the stops to make sure it was a barbecue that Mrs. Carmichael would hate. On the day of the event I had a live band playing upbeat music, at a totally legal volume, of course. A massive buffet with delicious barbecue, drinks and desserts. Outdoor games like cornhole, volleyball, and even a dunk tank. Over 50 guests, neighbors, friends, and even some HOA board members. It was an absolute blast. People were laughing, having fun, and enjoying themselves. And Mrs. Carmichael? She was fuming. She stood on her porch, arms crossed, watching with absolute disgust. I could practically see the steam coming out of her ears. She wanted to report me so badly, but she couldn't. I had followed every single rule. The best part came when my friend Jason, who happens to be a professional stand-up comedian, grabbed the mic. He started roasting HOA horror stories, cracking jokes about ridiculous rules and power-hungry board members. And then, with a sly grin, he said, "And you know, I used to think the weirdest HOA complaint I'd ever heard was about mailbox colors. But then my buddy over here got written up for laughing too much." The entire crowd erupted in laughter. Jason continued, "I mean, how miserable do you have to be to hate laughter? That's next-level villain behavior. That's like Disney villain levels of evil." By this point, people were crying from laughing so hard. And I saw Mrs. Carmichael storm into her house, slamming her door behind her. Mission accomplished. The barbecue was the talk of the neighborhood for weeks. People kept bringing up the excessive laughter complaint as a joke, making it impossible for Mrs. Carmichael to live it down. Even better? She stopped bothering me completely. It turns out that after being humiliated in front of the entire community, she had finally realized that she had lost. The best part? I never even had to break a single rule to get my revenge. I simply let laughter do the work for me. And that, my friends, is how you deal with a miserable HOA neighbor, with style.